Hi, it's Nathaniel here from the Cider Link, and this is an interview with Mike from Crucible Cider down in the Otways in Victoria. And Mike has over 25 years of cider making experience. He learned to make cider in the UK when he was over there with work a few decades ago, and he has been making cider in Australia ever since. And he has a very strict approach to making cider. He uses real cider fruit, English cider apples and French cider apples, no preservatives, bottle conditioned, method traditionnel for the fizz, and the result is a fantastic award-winning cider. It's a serious, dry, strong cider. It's absolutely delicious, and it really is something for people who are serious about cider. It's a pretty rare treat. You don't find many ciders like this in Australia. And Mike obviously knows a lot about it, so this is an interesting conversation. And so have a little listen and enjoy the interview. If you could just tell us a little bit about your background, please.
Originally chemical engineer, environmental engineer, business sustainability practitioner for about 40 odd years. And as a result of that, I and my family were sent to the UK in the 90s for several years to set up an office for one of our major clients. And while we were in England, as you do, we were looking for things to do indoors out of the cold, and we got into go-karting, archery, and cider making. So my first forays into cider were some very small batches using some of the apples from the southwest of England, where some of our forebears came from, and got into cider making there, effectively.
And when was that?
90 to 90, just before, well, it was mid-93, so we were there for 3.5 years.
Right. And then you decided to bring that back here to Australia?
Yeah, it was, I can't say my ciders were all that good when I first started, but brought it back here, and we had a rural property in the valley next to where we now are that had some very old apple trees on, some seriously big ones, and didn't even have any names to them. So we tried to do some botanical research, and it turned out that they were just very old varieties that had kind of morphed into their own style, based on some of the information from a guy called Clive Windmill, who was a specialist in apples. And so with that crop that was available, I started employing the tiny little press that we'd brought back from the UK and burnt out my wife's Magimix to the point where I acquired some reasonable gear to deal with it, and we started making kind of home cider for a while out of these apples. And it turned out okay, and we continued with that for a couple of years until the interest in the background of cider making and true artisan cider making became more of an interest for me, and we then got into acquiring, a range of the apple trees in my approach based on trying to get an optimum of the cider flavours. So for the brewing of the cider, the summary is to try and get an acceptable palette of bittersweet, bitter sharp, tannin, and a flavour profile. So I went and picked a range of trees that I thought would achieve that, with a view that we could try the cider the first year and see how it came out, and then maybe acquire some other apple trees to smooth the flavour, or change it to the point that was more acceptable. And it turned out the mix I had for the first year came out pretty well, so I've stuck with that mix and been playing with it for 3 or 4 years now to assess the different seasons with the changes in how the different either bittersweet or bitter sharp apples predominate each season.
And what kind of apple trees or varieties are you using?
The range is old heritage cider apples. There's 28 different types that go into the cider. It's probably 60 or 70% of them are old English varieties, and the remainder are old French varieties. Aranda Hative. In the English ones, there's Kingston Blacks as a traditional standard cider apple, along with many, many others. And we've got, as I say, a list of 28 of them that go in there.
And you mentioned before you're not using any preservatives at all.
It's one of the mantras we've had is not to add any kind of foreign. We don't use a winemaking approach to the cider making, so we don't put any additives, we don't do any kind of additions, and all of our care and attention goes into making sure the apples are in good condition and treated well, closeted, if you like, before they come up into the cidery. Then they're sat for a while to nurture on the skins, for depending on the season, 2 to maybe even if it's cool, up to 3 weeks prior to crushing, and then they're crushed, and it's a simple addition of yeasts to initiate the fermentation. So from then on, it's hands off, other than monitoring and making sure all is well. So it's a version of what used to be called method champenois, or we're required to say method traditionnelle now, and the only variation from that is a true method traditionnelle disgorges yeasts at the end to get a very clear product, and because of the nature of my bottles and the hand-made approach, the disgorging is reasonably difficult, and our view is that it actually detracts from the flavour, we think. So we get a nice, more mellow effect out of the cider with some remnant yeasts from the bottle fermentation that are left in. So in a way, it's a traditional, slightly cloudy, gold-coloured cider that we're aiming to achieve, and we've done that pretty much every year.
Yeah, delicious. So if someone has not tried your cider before, how would you recommend that they best enjoyed it?
Very cold and with food. It's a strong cider. It's not anywhere near like nothing like what some of the commercial sweet ciders at all. And it's different again to what would be called the New World cider that uses eating apples. It's a much stronger flavour profile, so it goes really, really well with strong food, strongly flavoured food. Pork, obviously. We had a launch of last year's cider with a little local restaurant who did roast pork as a main dish. And with our cider, he just happened to put a little bit of star anise in the rub on the pork. And I've never been in a restaurant where 50-odd people just went wow when they had the pork with the cider. The pairing was just hand in glove. It was amazing. So they go very well with that, or strong cheeses, or even a strong chicken dish. Things with strong flavours, they work really, really well. And because it's dry, you don't get the sugar overlay.
Oh, you're making me hungry now. All right. So what's next for you and Crucible Cider? Where to from here? We're
playing around with a few ideas, again going back to the roots of some of the traditional cider making. So we've next year, it's in the cans at the moment, or rather in the bottles, but we've made a trial batch of what's called a black cider, which is a version of the closest equivalent would be a stout-like cider, because the second ferment is done with molasses, not sugar. And that, at the moment, we've only had one preliminary tasting of that, and it's turning out quite interesting. It hasn't got an enormous molasses flavour because we were a bit tentative with how much we should use to produce the final ferment. And molasses, anyway, is pretty difficult to make sure that you disperse because it's so thick. So we, as I say, we've done the trial batch of that with a couple of thousand bottles, and the first tastings are pretty interesting. So that's going to be a developing style that we'll continue with from then on. And as well as that, we've also done a traditional perry. Again, that hasn't been released yet, but at the National Awards this year, the English judge that came out to oversee the judging process tried some of our perry and drank 3 bottles of it while we were there, so he quite enjoyed it. It's made only with 3 pear types, 2 eating pears, but we used that we've got on the property, but we've got one very large pear tree that has reverted back to an original style, so that the pears drop off and they're hard enough that the cows that we have running in the paddocks here can't even eat them. They're as solid as, and that's given it a really nice tanniny, dry note over the top of the sweetness, natural sweetness of pears. So it's a really nice drink.
So there you have it. That was Mike from Crucible Cider, and hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of what's in the bottle. This is a very unique cider. You don't find many ciders like this in Australia. It's organic. It's using loads of different types of apples, lots of cider fruit, and it's a real traditional kind of style. So this is the kind of cider that we absolutely love. So I would fully recommend that you give this a go, have a taste, have it with some food, and expect to be blown away, because I'm sure you will be. So have a go and let us know what you think. Give us some feedback. Cheers.